Hello, and welcome to the Dissident Mama podcast. Today, my guest is Dr. E. Michael Jones. Jones is a former professor of American literature, a traditional Catholic, pro-life activist, author, lecturer, and speaker. Welcome, Dr. Jones. I'm so excited to have you here.
Thank you, Mama. Good to be here.
So we both spoke at the Trad Forum back in September, and you were kind enough to agree to do an interview when I went up all nervous and introduced myself. So here we are. It took us a while, but it's finally happening. So let's dive into this. The Jerusalem Post recently wrote that the golden age for Jews in America is coming to an end. So as the author of the book, the very well-researched and influential book, The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit and Its Impact on the World, I thought that this would be a good time to keep talking about some of these things that have been previously very taboo topics, but that seem to be increasingly coming front and center in discourse. Kind of the Overton window is shifting on some of these things. So as a former professor and writer, I thought that we would talk about some words and what their meanings are. Can we start with that?
Sure.
Okay. Because I think a lot of times people talk about these topics that are controversial kind of around the edges or in the fringe, but I want people to know what we're talking about and what words mean. Okay. So one of the critiques is that there's disproportionate Jewish power. So I want you to tell me, what is the disproportionate part and what is Jewish power? What do you think that phrase means?
Well, first of all, the Jewish power is primarily the ability to control discourse. In other words, and the locus of Jewish power is the media. There are other aspects as well. There's financial control. But the main thing that the Jews did when they came over here was take over, get involved in Hollywood, get involved in the production of films. And at that point, they used their control of the media to shift the moral consensus away from what had been a kind of pan-Christian consensus. Now, the United States has always been divided according to religious sects. But the founding fathers felt that if you had a moral consensus, then that religious division wouldn't be as important. John Adams said, we have no constitution that functions in the absence of a moral people. So what you saw here at this point during the 1920s was the Jews' attempt to undermine that moral consensus. And they did it through Hollywood films featuring nudity largely, because they knew there was a prurient interest out there. They knew that there was this desire, this disordered sexuality that desired to see naked women and so on and so forth. They pandered to that, and there was a reaction. First, the Protestants reacted, got nowhere, and then the Catholics stepped up, and they imposed a boycott on Warner Brothers Theaters in Philadelphia, and it had a devastating effect, because this is 1932, I believe. The Hollywood had already gone into debt because of getting to the technology for talking pictures. They were in a very weak position, and they collapsed, and the Catholics basically imposed that previous moral consensus on the Jews. So no nudity, no ridicule of the clergy, no blasphemy, none of this type of stuff, no homosexuality. And it lasted for 31 years until 1965, when the Jews broke the code with a Holocaust porn movie called The Pawnbroker. At that point, you had a whole new era, largely created by the Catholics when they Vatican Council approved Nostra Aetate, which said that Catholic Church opposes all forms of anti-Semitism, without telling us what it meant. So what did that mean? We don't know. So as a result, the Jewish power at that point grew exponentially, absolutely exponentially from 65 on. I saw the correspondence between the producer of The Pawnbroker and Monsignor Little, who was the head of the Legion of Decency. And Eli Landau was saying, yeah, great new era of art in film. And Landau and Monsignor Little was saying, no, it's the thin end of the wedge. You're going to try and put pornography on the screen. And he was right. He proposed a scene. I don't know whether you're familiar with The Pawnbroker, but there's a scene where a black prostitute takes off her blouse, breaks the code, shows bare breasts. Monsignor Little was a smart guy, and he said to Landau, shoot the scene from behind the woman. That way you'll get Rod Steiger's face in the picture. He can act a little bit. It's much better scene, but that's not what they wanted. They wanted bare breasts. They wanted, and that's how they basically moved into the mind of the American people through Hollywood. Hollywood films kind of portray what is acceptable and what is not. And over this period of time, you had basically a whole erosion of the moral consensus and its replacement by Jewish values, leading to Roe versus Wade, the abortion decision, and then the surprise now, to get back to what's going on right now, after Roe gets overturned, you had 140 Jewish organizations saying abortion is a fundamental Jewish value, and that if you try to limit abortion, you're preventing Jews from practicing their religion. This is going to accelerate the decline of Jewish power. This is always the tragedy of the Jews. In that book you mentioned, The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit, I said that they rebelled against Logos when they killed Christ. Logos is order. It's the rational structure of the universe, but it's also limits. And so when they did that, the Jews don't know limits. They don't understand limits, and they're always screwing up their own game. And the longer they go on, the more they screw up. So you just had a recent example with this whole issue with Kyrie Irving. The NBA is one of the biggest propaganda outfits for Black Jewish collaboration. It's part of the Black Jewish Alliance. It was the main showcase for Black Lives Matter, to give Black Lives Matter legitimacy during their insurrection, for which they never got punished. You'd have LeBron James bloviating about Black Lives Matter. They had to wear it on their uniforms on the court. And the Greenblatt, the head of the ADL, wrecked it. Really stupid thing, because Jews don't know they don't know what self-control is. They have a word called chutzpah, which means, effrontery, something like that, daring, being outrageous. And they will go and transgress boundaries, because they love to transgress boundaries, until there's a reaction. And now I think they're starting to wear out their welcome. It's not the same group of people that I knew 50 years ago. It's like a generational change, and they've gotten more and more obnoxious over this period of time. They become more and more tyrannical. And I'm talking specifically about the internet, where they are now basically can ruin your life, cut you off from commerce, all these type of things, or do to you what they did to Kanye West, which is basically you say something they don't like, they will try to destroy you. Now, we have reached a point as Americans where it's time to say, Rumble has already done it. I think it's working now through Twitter. I think that they were really upset when Elon Musk took over Twitter. But now we're starting to see the reaction where a platform like Rumble is saying, if it's not illegal, you can say it. In other words, we can have First Amendment guarantees on the internet and stop this charade that this is somehow a private enterprise or a private operation. Musk blew that up when he revealed the files of the FBI contacting Yoel Roth and telling him who to attack and so on and so forth. It's a government agency. Last time I looked, the FBI is a government agency. They were manipulating Twitter. Therefore, the First Amendment should apply. So what happened here is Musk takes over. The Jews are upset. And Musk basically destroys the two pillars of Jewish thought control that were being exercised by Yoel Roth. Pornography got banned. And all other people who were banned for hate speech got amnesty, and people like me got back on. Now, there's a battle again. This battle is still going on. But I think what we're starting to see here is a consensus is starting to emerge that if you say the word Jew, that shouldn't be an occasion to destroy your life. And we are now, I think, starting to reach a consensus where there should be no group that is above criticism. And there should be no group that has so much power that they can destroy you and you have no recourse whatsoever. You can't appeal the legal decision because there is no legal decision. This is a totally extra legal process of basically ethnic terrorism that is un-American and has to stop. And I think they are starting to see the end of this, the end of their power. And so they write articles about, well, we're going to take our ball and go home. We're going to go someplace else where nobody has ever treated Jews better than the United States of America. No one, not even the Paradisus Judaeorum that was Poland in the Middle Ages. No country treated them better. And this is the way they treat the people that treat them well. So patience is wearing out. I think that's starting to change.
So you brought up a really good point that even uttering the word Jew was off limits. I mean, that's a very interesting thing, which is why I want to talk about what words mean. So what is a Jew? Is it ethnic? Is it religious? You know, Anne Hathaway, that actress, just converted. I do not think she's ethnically Jewish. Is she a Jew? What does all this mean? And I think it's often purposefully confusing, so nobody knows what the heck's going on, so they just stay silent.
Right. Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. So Dave Chappelle exposed this in that monologue on Saturday Night Live, where he says there are two words you should never put together, the and Jews. Well, that's true. He was telling the truth. That's why everybody laughed, because he told the truth here. What he's saying is that you're not allowed to have a category. This is a category. It means the Jews is a category. It means it's a group of people that you can identify, and more importantly, a group of people you can hold responsible for their behavior. So as soon as you try and hold this group responsible for their behavior, they say, you're a bigot because there's no such thing as the Jews. Well, this is ridiculous. This is ridiculous. So that was part of the problem here. If you don't have the category, you can't hold them responsible. And this is precisely the position I was in when I started to write The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit. So it was always like, oh, if you have three Jews, there are four different opinions, there are no groups. Unless you say something like, well, Jews have really high IQ. And of course, then they say, yeah, of course, you're right. So I had to come up with an understanding of the identity of this group. So what was it? Well, you have to go back to the crucial turning point in human history, which is when Jesus Christ arrives on this earth and arrives as a member of the chosen people of the Hebrews, and they have to make up their mind whether they are going to accept him or reject him on his terms. And there's a furious argument immediately. It's in the Gospel of St. John, where the Jews go to him, they kind of poke at him and say, you're not treating us with respect. We are the seed of Abraham, buddy. We have sacred DNA. Don't you know that? And Jesus kind of says, look, God doesn't need your DNA. He could take rocks and create a chosen people. This is God's doing. It's not yours. This is racial pride. This is racism on their part. They still have it. They never got over it. And he said, the crucial issue is not what your DNA is. It's are you a child of Moses? Now, DNA is a chemical. A child can act. And that's precisely what was going on. So if you accept Jesus Christ, you're a child of Moses. If you don't, you're the synagogue of Satan, all the other terms that they use. You're liars. You're the sons of the devil. The devil is your father, and so on and so forth. And so that's precisely what happens. So what's a Jew? A Jew is the Jews, the Jewish people. Now, this is a collective entity, just has the same meaning as the Jews. It's a collective entity that acts politically. Does it include every single Jew? No. But it's a political entity that functions that way. And so when it came to Christ, they decided we're going to kill him. Christ is the Logos incarnate. When you decide to attack Jesus Christ, you are rebelling against Logos, which is the order of the universe. When you do that, you become a revolutionary. And that's the definition of a Jew. A Jew is a rejecter of logos. That is his identity. There's no biological identity. There's no religious identity. Their covenant was destroyed in 70 AD when the Romans destroyed their temple. They made up a new religion at that point, which is the synagogue, which is basically a debating society that never reaches conclusions. And the protocol of that debating society is known as the Talmud, which is a huge book which goes in one rabbit warren after another and never comes to a conclusion. So you don't have that religious identity anymore. You don't have a racial identity, because what does it mean? What does it mean? If you're talking about DNA, the Blessed Mother had the same DNA as Herod. That's not the issue. And on top of that, the Ashkenazi Jews now are not Semites anyway. They're a Turkic race. So you have no biological continuity with Moses. You have no spiritual continuity with Moses, because Jesus Christ told you to your face, if you don't accept me, you're not a child of Moses. So the only identity you have is this revolutionary spirit, which is based on the rejection of Logos. And that clarifies the issue. And I can explain 2,000 years of history based on that definition.
Can you tell listeners, what is the Talmud? I think some people may have heard of it or heard it used as an adjective. Sometimes feminists will talk about being Talmudic or whatever. Can you tell people the gist of what's in it in reference to Christianity?
Well, in reference to Christianity, I mean, the Talmud is the codification of all those debates that took place in the school at Yavne and other related Jewish congregations, Jewish synagogues, over a period of 300 years, I think, for the Babylonian Talmud, and 600 years for the Palestinian Talmud. So it's a record of debates, controversies, some explanations. Now, the purpose of the Talmud. Now, this means that Judaism, as we know it today, is younger than Christianity, and the purpose of the Talmud is to keep Jews from accepting Christianity. It's totally negative, in keeping with the negative identity of the Jews. And so, when it comes to Christianity, they will say that the Blessed Mother was a whore who had sex with a Roman soldier, that Jesus Christ is a mamzer or a bastard. He's now burning in hell, in excrement, burning excrement in hell. Now, that gives you some indication of how they feel. Now, this is, America Magazine is the magazine of the Jesuits. The rabbi got on and said there were no insults in the Talmud against Christianity. The comm box immediately lit up with about 500 replies, and the Jesuits had to delete them all because everybody knows it's false, what you're saying here. So we know that it is basically, again, a negative document. It doesn't have a positive identity, it has a negative identity, because it's a reaction to that fateful decision that the Jews made when they rejected Jesus Christ.
You had said the word, you were talking about Semitism and anti-Semitism. Okay, well, what is a Semite? Sometimes it's lowercase, sometimes it's uppercase. Sometimes people say it has to do with language. Sometimes people say people from Lebanon are Semitic. Sometimes, some people say they're not. What is a Semite? So we can define what anti-Semitic is.
Semite is a biological term. So you can do an analysis of DNA and you'll find that Palestinians, for example, are Semites. They have certain things in common. And you also find out that the Ashkenazi are not Semites, they're Turkic. Okay, so that's where that began. Now, if you want to talk, if you want to talk about the term anti-Semite, it's a new term.
Right.
It was created in 1871 by Wilhelm Marr, who was a German revolutionary who wrote a book, Der Sieg des Judentums über das Germanentums, the victory of Jewishness over Germanness. And he chose this term because, first of all, because of the age. This is the high watermark of Darwinism, and we've got this biological determinism circulating around. But he didn't like religious terms. The religious terms didn't mean anything to him because he was a revolutionary. He was probably an atheist. He had been involved in the revolution of 1848. And during that revolution, he felt that in Hamburg, he felt the Jews had betrayed the revolutionaries. They sold out, made a separate piece, and he had this animus against the Jews, but he wanted a new way to talk about them. And so he decided that basically it was a question of their DNA. And they had bad DNA and they couldn't help themselves. This is completely antithetical to the traditional Christian critique of the Jews. Obviously, I've already mentioned it. Biology makes no sense if you're talking about the conflict in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus Christ, which led up to his death. They all had the same DNA. So how do you explain that? Well, he doesn't want to explain that because he doesn't want to talk about religion. Right. I'm saying you cannot understand this conflict unless you talk about religion. Yeah. And if you focus on racial issues, you're never going to get anywhere.
Yes. So for a revolutionary people who don't want to be categorized, yet want to be a protected class, obviously some people are seeing the hypocrisy in that.
Hypocrisy, that's the right word, yes.
Right. And so going back to anti-Semitism, yeah, I've seen to where some of the subversives will purposefully not capitalize it, so people will just think it just means anti-Jewish. They like the capital letter will make them think this must mean something, so it keeps people from looking into it. And I had read once that former Israeli education minister Shulamit Aloni, I think is how you pronounce her name, she said on Democracy Now! Years ago, like 20 years ago, that word is a trick. It's simply meant to silence criticism. So right. It's fascinating that people who don't want to be categorized in a group, but do. I mean, and then fanning the flames of anti-Semitism, everybody from G.K. Chesterton to the Apostle Paul to you to Kanye. You know, I think that's what's just wearing people down to where they're kind of like just over it.
Right. Let's cut to the chase here. An anti-Semite is anyone Jews don't like. That's what it means. Joe Sober used to say an anti-Semite used to be someone who didn't like Jews. Now it's someone Jews don't like. Okay, but let's be more specific now. An anti-Semite is anyone who criticizes Jews. So what you're saying when you use that term anti-Semitism is that no one is allowed to criticize Jewish behavior. Well, this is intolerable. This is another word for tyranny. The more power they get, the more they are influencing our lives in a negative way, whether it's from abortion to the war in the Ukraine, the war in the Iraq, the neocon warmongers, that becomes an oppressive burden on the entire American people. And no one's even allowed to talk about it because you're a bad person if you even think that there's a category called the Jews.
Correct. Okay, so what is a Zionist?
Okay, so you go back to the where the overwhelming majority of Ashkenazi Jews lived in the 19th century. It's the western border of Russia. It used to be the eastern border of Poland. And at this point, because they're on the western border now, all of this influence from the West is coming in largely through terrorist groups who are operating out of Russian universities. Narodnaya Volia is a terrorist group. They started off with a group called Cherny Peredel, which I think means the Black Path, where they were going to educate Russian peasants so that they would, rise up and overthrow the landlords, get the land. They got nowhere. As soon as the Jew showed up, he was recognized as a Jew and therefore an alien member of society, and they report him to the police. At that point, the Jews turned to terrorism. Now, that's one sort of influence that's coming in, okay, from the West, largely from German-speaking places like Berlin, because they spoke Yiddish, and Yiddish is a form of German, so it's a much more accessible language than it would be to Russians. It starts to come in, and that is basically Jewish internationalism. But there's a reverse antithesis to that would be Jewish nationalism. Jewish nationalism is Zionism. So at the beginning, Jewish internationalism was much more important and led to the formation of all of these terrorist groups. And it was only toward the beginning of the 20th century when people like Herzl start to go around that Jewish nationalism arose, basically in imitation of all the other nationalisms that everyone was seeing. This is the age of nationalism. And so why can't the Jews have their own nation? The Germans have their own nation. The French have their own nation. Why can't the Jews have their own nation? And that was basically Herzl's message. And the only people who took it seriously were the English, who had the mandate over Palestine at that point. And basically, the English sold out the Palestinians for Jew money because the Jews said, wanted to get them. The British needed Jewish support in World War I, and the Jews were happy to give it. We will get America into the war, the Jews said, if you give us our own homeland. And that's exactly what happened. The Balfour Declaration came out. And now, once you have this idea of Jews being allowed to settle there, Zionism takes off and becomes more and more dominant till basically 1967, the Arab-Israeli War. At this point, the Black-Jewish Alliance broke down, known as the Civil Rights Movement. The blacks got tired of being ordered around by the Jews, and the Jews felt their Schwarzes were ungrateful, and so they switched their allegiance to Israel, and it's only gotten stronger to this day.
So on Book TV 15 or 20 years ago, Dennis Prager said that Jews are among the leaders of the secularization of America. And he talked about the Jewish revolutionary spirit and how Jews had abandoned God and became just, uber political. So would you say that this revolutionary spirit is specifically about de-Christianizing the West? I mean, when you talk about the Logos, that's what you're referring to as just completely eradicating Christianity?
I think that they, I've already said the Talmud hates Christianity. Mm-hmm. But I think that now, if you're talking about Karl Marx, you're talking about this period. 1830 is when Goethe died. 1831 is when Hegel died. And Hegel believed in Geist, which is the spirit. And when they died, there was a reign of materialism. Materialism became important, largely because of the effect that the steam engine was having on everybody's imagination. And one of the people who was really impressed was Karl Marx, who took Hegel's basically spiritual understanding of the movement of Logos. His word is Vernunft. The German word Vernunft is the Greek word Logos, the movement of Logos in history, and he materialized it, which destroyed it. And I'm saying at that point, you had the rise of secularism, which I think is what Prager is talking about here. And so, but that doesn't stop there. What you have is basically, okay, you have these left-wing Jews. If you're talking about 1950, if you're a Jew, you're a communist. And you had these commies basically handing over atom bomb secrets to the Germans. I'm sorry, to the Russians. And the Jewish assimilationists are really embarrassed by that. The American Jewish Committee collaborated with the FBI to turn in Jewish commie spies. And so what you had here with the civil rights movement was the culmination of this revolutionary movement, and it created a reaction among the Jews as well. So after the Great Civil Rights March in 1963, you have Abraham Heschel walking arm in arm with Martin Luther King. Norman Podhoretz writes an article called My Negro Problem and Ours about how little Jews are not benefiting from this because we get beat up on the streets and so on and so forth. And that created neoconservatism. So now you got Jews, they're conservative now. And that's where you have the rise of, so you have Norman Podhoretz, and then they start to take over the conservative movement, exactly what they did. Norman Podhoretz and Midge Decter helped Richard John Newhouse, who was a Catholic at that point, steal $250,000 from the Rockford Institute and create First Things. And now you have neoconservatism. So yeah, they're on our side. Well, no, they're not. No, they're not. They are using your antipathy toward communism to insinuate themselves into a movement. If, as Father Hesburgh said, if you let the Jews in, they take over, which is what they did to the conservative movement. So eventually, when Russell Kirk, who is one of the founders of the conservative movement, wrote The Conservative Mind, He said, Tel Aviv is not the capital of America in a speech at the Philadelphia Society. They drove him out of his own movement and they took it over. And now it's the neoconservative. And in order to be really a conservative, you have to support the state of Israel. Well, wait a minute. Who said that? Why am I being dragged into? I thought I was a conservative. Why do I have to do that now? And they'll give you the impression that they are against abortion. But then that changed when 140 Jewish organizations came out and said abortion is a fundamental Jewish value. I confronted Ben Shapiro in South Bend. He was speaker here. I said, Ben, it's 140 Jewish. He said, that's not true. That's not. Well, wait a minute, Ben. Who are you? Are you the Jewish Pope? You want to excommunicate every other Jew because you want to have some type of control of the pro-life movement? That's the way I'm saying history evolved here, so that they end up basically owning both sides of the argument. Right.
Yeah, I watched that exchange. I'll link to that in the show notes because it was pretty fascinating. And it said, I believe he said, the vast majority of Jewish organizations don't know anything about Judaism. And he actually said he's questioned all the time about why so many Jews vote liberal or in favor of anti-religious positions, in favor of gay marriage. And he just said the vast majority are non-observant. And your whole point would be there's nothing to observe that's religious, correct?
Right. I mean, first of all, who are you to say, Ben, that you are the normative, you are the lawgiver for the Jewish people? Because I'm saying that the Jewish revolutionary spirit is the essence of Jews. And sometimes that manifests itself as religious behavior. I'm not denying that. But most of the time, the course of the 20th century is the real Jews are the Jews that get out there and like Lenin, like Trotsky, you know what I mean? Who overthrow the social order. So you're saying they're not really, well, who are you to say that the majority of Jews are not Jews? There's no Pope, there's no magisterium, and so it's majority rules. And if 140 Jewish organization says abortion is a fun, I have to accept it. Right. We have to accept that, but we also have to draw the consequences from that. And I'm saying the consequences, if abortion is a fundamental value of yours, you're not worshiping Yahweh. You're worshiping Moloch. Now, I said that on Twitter. Well, you should, all angry Jews, shouting at me, picking up stones, ready to stone me. The conclusion is inescapable. It's inescapable. And what has to happen is this has to trickle down to the general consciousness of the people of the United States of America. So this is not some type of benign operation here. These are baby killers. This is what they believe. Is this compatible with Christianity? No. Then this will have severe consequences for Catholic-Jewish dialogue, which has been laboring under an illusion now for 60 years, that we have something in common, that they're our elder brothers in the faith. That's not true. This is wrong. And we have to go on. So if this is the case, then it's not collaboration. What we have to do is everything within our power to thwart the Jewish agenda. In the same way that we have, as pro-lifers, we have been doing what we have in our power to thwart abortion, because they're one and the same thing. The Jews have told us that.
Yes, just before Christmas, even AOC was talking about the religious rights that, the Supreme Court had overturned and we're becoming a theocracy. And she was, referencing how it was an imposition of governmental Christianity, and it's infringing on the religious liberty of every American Jew.
Right.
So do you think, and, January 22nd will be 50 years since Roe came into existence, and so many children have died. But do you think that this is the time when kind of the mask is coming off, so to speak, to where, the people who have been such good allies of Israel and the Jewish people, Protestants, a lot of them, Jews are the chosen people. You have to, they fly their American flag right beside their Israeli flag. Do you think this will be the thing that will wake them up to say, hey, maybe this isn't a team that meshes
Right.
together, you know?
Yeah, look, I was in Oklahoma. One of my I have a children, son and daughter-in-law, and children live in Oklahoma. Oklahoma is really pro-life, and it's really pro-Israel.
Mhm.
Well, that's a contradiction.
Mm-hmm.
And it's up to us to bring this to the fore here. Now, I had dinner with a guy who was told me he was raised as a typical Sooner along those lines, and he said to me, when I started listening to you, my whole world fell apart. And I think what happened is that he understood that contradiction for the first time, because I was the one who brought it out.
Right.
But this is what we have to, this is the way we have to talk to the Christian Zionists out there. It's starting to happen. You have a guy like the guy of Rick Wiles on True News. I know Protestants who used to be Christian Zionists who have changed on that issue. But this is what the moment of opportunity, because when AOC says, you Christians are imposing your religious views, what she's really saying is, the Jews imposed their views with Roe versus Wade. It's inescapable. If you're saying one, you have to say the other. And that means that the Jews imposed their religion on us for 49 years. And they never told us, because no one before this point ever said that abortion was a fundamental Jewish value. That whole debate that took place in New York, where it started with Bernard Nathanson, this never was mentioned. The only religion that got mentioned was Catholicism, and that's because Catholic bishops wanted to impose their views. Bernard Nathanson was not described as a Jew. He was a gynecologist. He was a scientist, the whole thing. Now it's a completely different situation. So if AOC is saying Hobbes imposed Christianity, then what we have to say then is that Roe imposed Jewish values on the rest of us for 50 years. And millions of children died because of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wrote a 5-part series a few years ago called Seeing the Forest Through the Trees. And it was basically trying to tell people it's okay to notice patterns, right? If there are these things that you're upset about, abortion, anti-whiteness, that's really what I started looking into it when I really started discovering, wow, this anti-whiteness thing is a real thing and it's aimed right at my children. And I want to know more about it and where it comes from. And throughout that series, I made it a point that was actually very easy to do, to only quote Jewish publications or Jewish scholars who were talking very honestly, either bragging about how great, anti-whiteness was or whatever left-wing thing they were pushing, or it was, an honest anti-war Jew talking about, the scourge of Zionism and neoconism and stuff like that. But it was really easy to do. I mean, you have Jewish publications like Forward and Haaretz that talk about how great it is that Jews were founders of feminism and, early homosexual and transgender rights people. And, jewishlives.org has this book collection talking about heroes, Jewish heroes. Well, I mean, it's Marx, Trotsky, and Goldman, it's like, okay, we're not allowed to make these connections and say that's a very strange thing to be proud of, and we're not supposed to notice it,
Right. That's exactly the point that I'm trying to make. You are not allowed to form that category called the Jews. And once there's one category you're prohibited from forming, then maybe all categories are suspect. Right. Maybe we can't have categories. Maybe you're a bigot if you say that there is such a group. Mm-hmm. Well, that destroys your ability to think. You can't make connections once that, because they've instilled this fear in you that if I use this category, I will be demonized as an anti-Semite and I will be punished. Yeah. That's the fundamental chain. These are the fundamental chains that have held us captive for all this period of time. We have to break these chains. We have to have the freedom to form our own categories and have our own discussion based on those categories.
Yes, and that's one reason I love your work, is because how can we resist and fight against all these evils being foisted upon us if we can't know who's pushing it, Now, there are a lot of non-Jews who go along with the program. Let's be blunt about
Sure,
that. A lot of
sure.
white women too. But it was Susan Sontag who, more than 50 years ago, that said the white race is the cancer of human history.
Right.
Well, her real name isn't even Susan Sontag. It's Susan Rosenblatt or whatever the heck it is. And, Noel Ignatieff, however you say his name, he was a
Right.
huge anti-white guy. Well, when
Right.
somebody's
Yes.
anti-white, that's a
Yeah.
problem for me.
Yeah. No, this I'll give you a classic example of this. Archbishop Chaput, the retired Archbishop of Philadelphia, wrote an article about four first things about school prayer, and how he said this was the beginning of the decline of America when they banned school prayer, the Supreme Court. And then so he comes and he says, now who did this? Well, it was secularizing activists. Well, who are they? Can I look it up under S in the phone book if there's still a phone book? Or is it under A? Or what is it? Well, it's completely ridiculous because the Supreme Court decision was Shemp versus School Board of Abington. Abington's a suburb of Philadelphia. The people that put Shemp up to it was the American Jewish Committee, and the lawyer who argued the case was Leo Pfeffer, who bragged about how much he hated the Catholic Church. Now, Chaput's article is going to have no effect because he censored himself about something that is obvious and should be obvious to someone who is the Archbishop of Philadelphia, because the Supreme Court decision was based in a suburb of Philadelphia. This is the type of self-censoring that leads nowhere, and you'll end up never understanding what's going on or it being able to have an effect for the good because of that self-censorship.
Is this so possible? This psychological trauma that is being forced upon people who can see connections and see what's happening, but we're told that we're bad people for talking about it. Is this only possible because of the Holocaust, with or without a capital H? I think it was Shlomo Sand who called it the Holocaust industry. I think you've called it the Holocaust narrative.
Yeah, it was Norman Finkelstein, I believe, who came up with that term. Okay. And he talked about his parents who were in a concentration camp. They never got a nickel. And all of these reparations payments were going into the pockets of the big Jewish organization. It was a shakedown operation. Yeah, you're right. The founding myth, if we date the American empire as beginning after World War II, the founding myth of the American empire is the Holocaust narrative. There's absolutely no question. That's how it got started. If you're talking about the actual beginning of this, it was Eisenhower and the army he was in charge of entering Ohrdruf, a concentration camp, entered the place. There are dead bodies all over the ground. Nobody knows about Ohrdruf. It's not mentioned anymore. Dead bodies all over the ground. And how'd they die? So you got two things here. Dead bodies, that is a category of reality. Now we're going to assign some type of meaning to it, and this is where the Holocaust come in. Problem, though, is there are no gas chambers at Ohrdruf. There are no instruments that would lead to the killing of these people. It's obvious from looking at the bodies that they weren't shot or anything like that. And so conclusion you have to draw is that they died of typhus, starvation, because the Allies were, so there was real suffering, real Jewish suffering at this time. But that's not what the Holocaust narrative is. And so Eisenhower calls in his head of psychological warfare, General McClure, and says, we got a congressman, get the New York Times here, take the pictures, and so on and so forth. And now the American soldier will know what he's fighting for. That's a direct quote from Eisenhower. So apparently there was doubt in their mind. And there was also problems that Eisenhower had that he didn't want to deal with, namely his involvement in war crimes. The Americans were heavily involved in war crimes. The whole bombing strategy of both England and the United States was one big war crime. They had the firebombing of Dresden before this happened, months before this happened, and they needed a way to exculpate themselves from their criminal behavior, and that became the Holocaust narrative. Now, in order to do that, so McClure says, all right, I got the guy for you. It's C.D. Jackson. Well, his real name is Jacobson. He's a Jew. So they march into Birkenwald, Buchenwald, Buchenwald, wrong tree, Buchenwald. And he stages this thing. This is the Holocaust. We caught them red-handed. We're here, right here. And he has a table there. And they get the orders, the entire couple thousand people from Weimar, which is right down the road, 6 miles down the road. They have to march out there and see what the atrocities were. And on the table there is 2 shrunken heads. A lampshade made out of human skin, reportedly, allegedly, and a pelvis, a human pelvis that was used as an ashtray. Now, have you heard about any of this? That went down the memory hole years ago, but fortunately, it's all on film, and they got Billy Wilder to film it. Billy Wilder steps into one of the frames at a certain point. So what you're seeing here, okay, Jacobson's a Jew, Jackson's a Jew. He calls in, who are the experts on propaganda? Well, it's Hollywood. Billy Wilder would go on to become famous as the director of Marilyn Monroe and Some Like It Hot. He made a lot of comedies in Hollywood. This is how this thing got started. You have this guy filming something, and then what? But the problem is you're constantly bumping into problems like shrunken heads. What are you kidding me? Did Germans shrink heads? I didn't know this. No, they were taken from a museum because they had come from the Amazon. That's where they shrink heads. It's got nothing to do with it. So all of it, it's constantly, you come up with a narrative, the narrative blows itself up like this, and then you go on to the next one, and everything goes down the memory hole. And so it's just one story after it's story. Basically, the book I'm writing about the Holocaust narrative is in many ways right up my alley because I have a PhD in literature. And it's like one piece of literature after another. It's the Diary of Anne Frank. It's Elie Wiesel's Night. It's The Painted Bird by Yeshe Kosinski. No one talks about that anymore. It's Sophie's Choice. All of these things taken together created a narrative that is full of contradictions. So it's one of the things you have to believe in the gas chambers. But if you read Elie Wiesel, it's flaming pits. And he says, I was there as the Germans threw babies into flaming pits. Well, where'd that go? Where'd that go? So that's the story. They're caught up. And then the crucial turning point came with Schindler's List when Spielberg basically asked everybody to come forward, tell your stories. Well, he was inundated with people. Everybody wanted to tell their stories. So he created the Shoah Foundation. And the Shoah Foundation basically, anybody can say whatever they want. Now, Spielberg is in a bind at this point when he's doing Schindler's List, because at this point, the gas chambers are part of the canon of Holocaust behavior. So I don't know whether you've seen the list. I've seen the movie, but we got the story. One of the classic tropes of the Holocaust narrative is ladies, take off your clothes. They never got away from porn. It was always borderline pornography. Actually, if you see Ilse, She-Wolf of the SS, that's real pornography, and that was made around the same time. Okay? But anyway, so we get the ladies. All right, take off your clothes, lady. They bring them into the room. There's the shower. There's the shower. And what happens next? Did you see the film?
I actually have never seen it.
Okay, then I'll tell you what happens next. Do you know what comes out of the shower heads?
Gas.
No, water.
What?
Water.
Oh.
They're getting a shower. Well, wait a minute. This means that Steven Spielberg is a Holocaust denier.
Yeah.
Because what's supposed to come out is poison gas. It doesn't happen. Well, what happened to the narrative? And why isn't Debbie Lipstadt going after Steven Spielberg? Well, because. And so what happened after that point, the narrative they had a crucial turning point at this point, and they decided that we're not doing history anymore. So Raoul Hilberg is kind of marginalized. He was the big historian. He's marginalized. And what you have are memoirs. Well,
Okay.
anybody can say anything now.
Right.
And there's some Spielberg's paying someone to hold the mic. And so you got one absolutely crazy story after another. And then it became part of the literature. So you have a man by the name of Benjamin Wilkomirski, wrote a beautiful story of being a child in a concentration camp. It's called Fragments. Except there is no man, Benjamin Wilkomirski. It turns out that the guy who wrote it, he's supposed to be from Latvia. It turns out the guy who wrote it was a Swiss orphan by the name of Dosiker. He's not a Jew. He wrote it a completely confected narrative, and Debbie Lipstadt's defending it until finally he goes on 60 Minutes, and 60 Minutes destroys the guy.
Wow.
Okay, so I guess it's not Holocaust denial anymore. That wasn't the end. Then you had the Rosenblatts going on Oprah talking about the apple, throwing this lady threw an apple over the fence in Auschwitz. It's a touching story. There wasn't a dry eye in the audience after they told their story, except they made it up.
Right.
And then he said, well, the guy who said it, Mr. Rosenblatt, said, well, it was true in my mind. And then you have a story of Misha Difoneska. This is a story, it's just this heartwarming story of a 9-year-old girl who travels 900 miles across Europe in a pack of wolves to rescue her parents from Auschwitz. Now, that's an incredible, well, yeah, it is, because it never happened.
Yeah.
Wait a minute. Her name isn't Difoneska. After all, she's not a Jewish lady. She's a Catholic by the name of DeVale, who made it all up.
Wow. This is why, I have my truth is such a important phrase these days.
Yeah, well, what you were talking about here, fundamental problem here. What is truth? Pontius Pilate said it. We live in an age where truth is the opinion of the powerful. That's what it is. If a powerful person or a powerful group, and there's no more powerful group when it comes to media than this group, if they say it, it's true. Well, it turns out that's not the case. In the long run, the truth is going to prevail. What is the real definition of truth? It's the correspondence between the mind and the thing. So the mind, you can't say it's true in my mind because it has to correspond to a thing.
Right.
And that's what's happening here. The whole thing is starting to unravel because they should have just left it alone. But they can't leave it alone. There's always got to be something one step farther into this transgressive behavior. And at a certain point, it blows up, and then nobody believes it anymore.
And my thing is, there's always survivors. And I'm like, this was a long time ago. Eventually, we're going to run out of survivors, right?
No, they're paying more and more money as time goes on. So one lady actually said she is channeling survivors. Does that mean you get reparations payment? Well, yeah, the German government will do anything. They are completely in the pocket of this group of people, and this group of people has been looting the German nation for what is it now? 70 years now, over 70 years.
I think shakedown is a good word. And it's interesting too, I think the more people talk about the Holocaust and we start to see that every movie is about that, or every time there's a bad guy, he's a secret Nazi. And I think people get really burnt out on that, and they start to think, okay, what is a Holocaust denier? Let me go really do some research as to what the Holocaust with a capital H is. And I think that's, a really important thing. They don't want people looking at the history because my kids are like World War I and World War II buffs. And, they're always like, well, Mom, the Jews weren't even rounded up till 1943 or whatever the heck it was. It wasn't even like in the plans till like the war was even underway. And just something like that, I think, can like plant a seed that, hey, well, I never knew that. Maybe there's a lot I don't know.
Well, shouldn't we be able to do research?
Yeah.
When you institute, now there's a law in Germany which
Yeah.
basically says it's paragraph 130. It's against Volksverhetzung, ethnic incitement. But basically, if you do research and you come up with the wrong conclusion, you go to jail.
Yeah.
Well, that's tyranny.
Yeah.
That's tyranny. You cannot suppress the truth.
Yes.
If you try, you will try. It requires enormous amounts of psychic energy. And in the end, you will discredit yourself and the government will fail because the truth is going to prevail. We've already seen too many examples of how the truth is going to prevail. You know, there may be a short term where the lie is mandatory, but over the long haul, the truth is going to prevail.
And I think the use of the word denier for like science denier when it came to COVID, or climate denier, you know, if people aren't like into carbon credits and all this kind of stuff, I think overusing that word has made people question Holocaust denial. Like, well, okay, what is this thing? You know, I didn't get a jab. I'm not a science denier. Well, maybe this whole word denier is used purposefully. You know?
Well, that's where you see how the Holocaust narrative basically informs every narrative, and it become a kind of mission creep. So the classic example was the Canadian trucker operation, where a lady, Jewish member of Congress, the truckers are there in Ottawa, and the Jewish member of Congress stands up and she announces, I have relatives who died in the Holocaust. Well, at that point, wait a minute, everybody now has to roll over and play dead because no one can dispute what you're going to say because you opened like that. And then she says, Hong Kong equals Heil Hitler. That's a direct quote from this lady. Hong Kong equals Heil Hitler. So in other words, all I have to do is associate you with the Holocaust, and I win the argument, and you lose, and you go to jail.
Wow. And the aforementioned Dennis Prager recently wrote, if Holocaust deniers don't go to hell, there is no God. So there you go.
Yeah. So I responded to that. And I said, baptism is necessary for salvation, not opinions on the Holocaust. And I got banned from Twitter for saying that.
Really?
Yes. The ban is up now, but I mean, it led to a complaint. And so this is a fundamental issue that we have to resolve. We can't go on this way. It is crazy, absolutely crazy. No, you can't know what's going to get you banned from the internet. Anything. It's absolutely crazy. I was hoping that Elon Musk takeover would establish some type of rationality. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. We're in the middle of the battle. It's too soon to tell. But sooner or later, we are going to have to nationalize these institutions, these new technologies, these platforms, by saying simply, the rule here is the First Amendment. If it's not illegal, you can say it. No group is above criticism. It's not a sin to say the word Jew. You should not have your life ruined because you said the word Jew on the internet. That is intolerable, and it's got to change.
Didn't Senator Mike Lee recently talk about, banning pornography or something to that effect?
Yes. And in order to do this, we have to understand what pornography is. And pornography, I wrote a book called Libido Dominandi, Sexual Liberation and Political Control. Pornography is a weapon. It's pictures of naked women. Obviously, that's what it is. But it gets used as a weapon in psychological warfare. And so, just aside from, the battleground is the internet right now, still the battleground. There was a point when Yoel Roth was in charge of what content at Twitter. You could type in #hijab. Okay, hijab is the scarf that Muslim women wear over their heads. At this moment in time, there was the hijab crisis in Iran, where you had a rebellion against the mullahs. Women are taking off their hijab. So you type in hijab, let's see what's going on. It was pornography. Well, wait a minute, I didn't bargain for this. I didn't log on to Pornhub or whatever it was. That was Yoel Roth. And that was one of the main pillars of Jewish control, because you become disoriented. That's the whole point of pornography. You become disoriented. You lose your train of thought. You suddenly get involved. The passions get aroused. You get involved. Now, wait. What was I looking for? Wait a minute. This is not what I. That's the way it works. You combine that with hate speech, and you've got Jewish thought control, and that's the big breakthrough that came about when Elon Musk took over Twitter.
Right, and tell listeners why you are referencing porn as being something that would have an effect on Jews. What is it about porn and Jewishness?
Well, pornography has been a Jewish creation. I mean, forever. First of all, okay, let's back up here. Pornography is always a function of technology. Okay, so if you read my book, The Dangers of Beauty, the first European pornographer was Aretino, and the technology, he wasn't a Jew, but the technology was the printing press. Mm-hmm. Well, it developed the photography. It was about 5 minutes between the invention of photography and the first naked woman that showed up in a picture. It happened like that, and that became the cutting edge, and it reached its culmination in the 1970s with magazines like Playboy, Penthouse, Hustler, high resolution glossy pictures. At that point, it moved to moving pictures. At that point, it became Deep Throat. At that point, it became the internet. And that became the cutting edge of technology. So the Jews have been behind us every step of the way, all the way up to Yoel Roth at Twitter. That has been, the Jews have used this to wage war on the moral standards of the people, because they knew the more they could corrupt the morals, the more power they had. The best example of that, of the sexualization of the culture, is the Catholic women during the 60s going to those private schools outside of Philadelphia. I went to one of them outside of Philadelphia. You go to mixers and you dance with the girls and so on and so forth. The nuns became feminists. The girls became sexually active. After they become sexually active, they get pregnant, and some of them had abortions. When you have an abortion, abortion is the Jewish sacrament. You become a Jew. Now, wait, what does that, wait, hold on. Well, what do I mean by that? You act like a Jew. And how do I know you act like a Jew? Because you vote like a Jew. So how did Josh Shapiro get elected governor of Pennsylvania? You cannot get elected to governor of Pennsylvania unless you have the Catholic vote. And the Catholic vote that put him in office was the Catholic women who had abortions. That is a fundamental constituency of the Democratic Party. This is obvious. If you commit the sin of abortion, you can go to confession and your sin will be forgiven. But there are lots of people who say, I'm going to make wrong right, and I'm going to join arms with all of my sisters. And that becomes a Jewish controlled movement known as feminism. Feminism.
Yeah, so I think you either I read this in one of your articles or you talked about it at the Trad forum, but a greater Israel logic, well, where power goes well beyond the political boundaries of Israel, and it's almost like a divine right to control, and it's kind of like this ethno-nationalism, but on a global scale. Is that what you see going on in Ukraine? You know, because a lot of people are like, well, how can Zionists ally with Nazis in Ukraine? And, you know, how can Azov, they can't be Nazis because Zelensky's a Jew, you know, this whole kind of thing. How do you see that playing out, like geopolitically in wars?
Well, the NATO is the aggressor there. And the lady who did this was Victoria Nuland, who basically used $6 billion to overthrow the democratically elected government in the Ukraine in 2014. The group she used to do that were the Nazis, the descendants of Stefan Bandera, the Azov Brigade, because they're criminals. They have a criminal mind. They're willing to engage in criminal behavior. In this case, murdering people. So you had, basically, it's portrayed in the news as some type of peaceful demonstration. No, they had weapons and they were shooting. It was an insurrection. And they murdered people. Odessa, there was an atrocity committed in Odessa. So once this is neoconservative foreign policy that has been pursuing Russia ever since the Victoria Nuland's grandparents came over from the Pale of the Settlement. They brought this grudge against Christian Russia with them. The Tsar had engaged in pogroms. They rose to power in George W. Bush's administration when they were known as neoconservatives. Mm-hmm. People like Paul Wolfowitz was the architect of the war in Iraq, the war against Iraq, and their power has increased over this period of time. That's the cause of the war in the Ukraine.
Right. So
Russia is trying to make peace. Putin's trying to make peace. He signs what is called the Minsk agreements. And now just a month ago, Angela Merkel, who was supposed to help out police these things, said, oh, it was all a joke. We didn't take it seriously. We're just buying time for the so that Ukraine can arm itself. So you put all this together and you've got basically this Jewish-led neoconservative foreign policy that is leading us to the brink of war, using Nazis. And then the question comes up and the ADL has to come out with an explanation. Well, they're good Nazis.
Right.
This shows you the hypocrisy, but again, back to the Holocaust narrative. It doesn't, okay, it's only useful when we want it to be useful. Here we have real Nazis, going all the pictures of all the Nazi insignia, and they're not even going to go along with that. So it's pure hypocrisy, pure theater.
And the whole neocon engendering anti-Russian hatred during the Cold War, I think that is obviously playing into it too, because there are a lot of people in my family, boomers, older folks that, they just see Russians as commies. They equate that as a synonymous thing when it's not. I try to explain to them Russians suffered under the communists. Solzhenitsyn would be the first one to say that Bolshevism was a Jewish phenomenon. Did that mean that people who were non-Jews didn't play along? Well, obviously not. Stalin was not Jewish, but this was all, it's all playing into this 20th century mentality. And I think so many people have a hard time stepping back and seeing what's happening there. When it's like, hey, the people who are arming Ukraine and hate Putin and want you to hate Putin also hate you. That's kind of the point I try to make to them.
Right. You have to understand the Russian Revolution and the Jewish participation in the Russian Revolution. So you have people now whipping up frenzy in the Ukraine against the Russians because the Russians, they starved us to death in the 1930s. Oh, wait a minute. Was Lazar Kaganovich a Russian? No, he was a Jew. And so it was the Jewish animus against the Russian people that was the fueled the whole secret police operation known as the Cheka. Salo Baron said they couldn't get Russians to torture and murder other Russians, but they could get Jews to do it. It was Jews and Latvians basically who ran that operation. Okay, well, now we're going to say that they were Russians because they were part of the Soviet Union. No, we can't allow. This is identity theft.
Right. Absolutely.
This is one of the biggest issues of our day is identity theft. And we have to fight it whenever we can.
I'm writing that down. That's a good term. Yeah, it always shocks people when I tell them that Stalin wasn't Russian, that he was Georgian. People are like, really? So that's a way you can kind of get them to kind of pivot and think about some of this too. Recently, Larry Fink of BlackRock wants to, he's going to attract investors and help rebuild Ukraine. And you had said, I think it was on Telegram, does anyone remember how Jeffrey Sachs looted Russia for Wall Street Jews after the fall of communism? Tell us about the whole, the whole looting, coming in, destroying something, and then coming in and pretending to offer help, but really they're all just getting rich. Yeah,
well, we had a moment of opportunity in 1989, 1991. What should have happened is that we should have dismantled NATO and helped Russia integrate with the West. What we had was the exact opposite. The Russians agreed in good faith to do this, to shut down the Soviet Union without a war. And what was the response? Jeffrey Sachs shows up as the agent of Jewish looters, created the oligarchs, used Wall Street money to buy up Russian, like Gazprom, the Russian wealth, Russian utilities that were basically owned by the Russian people, buy them up in a song, privatize these operations, and then ship the money out of the country, back to Wall Street. And in the process, creating 8 oligarchs that basically controlled the wealth of Russia, 7 of whom were Jewish. Now, Jeffrey Sachs has apparently just written an article. I just saw the article today explaining what really went on. Well, that's what really went on. I'm sorry, Jeffrey Sachs seems to have had a conversion experience.
Yeah, I was surprised.
I think I know I think he's been in contact with the Jesuits. I think I know the Jesuit who brought about this conversion experience. He was a friend of mine. He's dead now. And there seems to be, look, I'm all for conversion. But I'm saying that doesn't obliterate the past, and no one can change the past. Mm-hmm. And it's our duty to understand the past so that we don't repeat what happens in the future. And so when you tell me that the Jew Zelensky is going to sign a deal with the Jew Larry Fink from Wall Street, well, I immediately think of Jeffrey Sachs and the looting that took place then. So I think what we're seeing set up here is they're going to loot the Ukraine in the interest of private equity coming in. Oh, we're going to help you. We're going to lend you money and take over all your operation. That's what I see happening. And I think we have to, it's dependent on what I said before. If there's no category called the Jews, mm-hmm. Well, then what's the connection between Jeffrey Sachs, Larry Fink, and Vladimir Zelensky? Do you think people like this get together and cut deals? I think so. I think it's easier for them because they are the same group of people and they share the same values. And that's why I'm suspicious. That's why I tweeted that about Larry Fink and Zelensky.
Yeah, and I try to make the point about the whole destroying and then coming in and looting. I call it like carpet bagging, and I try to explain to good, very unreconstructed Southerners that hate Putin and, fly their Ukraine flags or have their Ukraine flag emojis or whatever, that sees Putin as Lincoln. And I try to tell them, we're Lincoln. We're the ones coming in, destroying everything, and then people are going to swoop on in and take it all, and the natives are going to be left with nothing. Right.
The issue is identity theft.
Yeah.
The Americans are victims of identity theft, and we have to reassert our identity. I just gave a speech in Evansville to factory workers. It was like the 1930s, me talking to factory workers, and I said, look, there are 2 options here. There is the Catholic option and there's the Jewish option. Catholic says labor is the source of all value. The Jew believes in usury. The conflict is between Main Street and Wall Street. And the problem is that Main Street has lost its identity.
Yep.
Largely because of the Jewish control of the media that turns America first into some type of anti-Semitic conspiracy. We have to be able to regain our identity, Christian identity. And this is how we're going to do it. We're going to have to keep talking to people.
Right. And,
Mama, mama. We've been talking for over an hour.
Yes. Let me ask you one last question.
Oh, mama, can this really be the end?
One last question, and this was really going to be my last question. So, the ADL since 2010 has been helping to train FBI agents, to root out extremism, terrorism, hate crimes, all these kinds of things. How are we supposed to counter that? Just still talking about this?
First of all, a fundamental problem right now in this country is Jewish law enforcement. The main manifestation is Soros prosecutors all over the country. They get George Soros money and they refuse to prosecute crimes.
Yeah.
But what you had here now is a real issue, which is basically you got Merrick Garland, who is Attorney General, a Jew who believes, I assume, he believes that abortion is a fundamental Jewish value. And so as a result, you've got enforcement of the imposition of his values on law enforcement. So around the time of Black Lives Matter, right to life centers, churches were burned to the ground, and there's not one case that's been prosecuted. On the other hand, in Pennsylvania, you have a pro-lifer by the name of Mark Houck, who was protesting at a clinic. There's an altercation at the clinic. Nothing comes of it. Okay. The FBI shows up, 30 FBI agents with drawn guns, drag this guy out of his house in his underwear in front of his traumatized children and wife, and in a charade, a purely political operation. This has got to stop.
Yeah.
We have to have a debate about whether can Jews enforce the law, or is the only thing they're going to enforce are their own ethnic prejudices when it comes to issues like abortion. They cannot be, I'm saying they cannot be neutral when it comes to abortion. It is one of their fundamental values. They want to impose it on the rest of us. And so therefore this disqualifies them from having any position of authority when it comes to law enforcement.
Right. The anarcho-tyranny where the drag queens and all the participants in that are protected, and the moms, resisting that are the bad guys.
Absolutely. I have to say here, there was a confrontation between the Proud Boys and the drag queen story hour crowd at a library in South Bend, Indiana. Okay, big news. So who shows up to give commentary on this, defending the drag queen story hour? The local representative of the ADL.
Right.
And then the evening news came. Oh, suddenly the ADL guy is gone. Moisha got on the phone and said, "You're making a fool, and don't do that in South Bend." Anyway, but that's what happened. So that's the category. We have to hold these people responsible. We have to say, look, this is what they're doing. Oh, we don't like it. It's not compatible with American values. And therefore, we have to be able to criticize these people in order to bring about change.
And it's just rhetorically resisting.
Everything begins with consciousness, and consciousness begins with speech. And so what we're doing tonight is crucial in order to basically right the ship before it goes under.
Well, we started this interview off talking about shifting the Overton window. I hope this conversation has helped to keep it moving, because I think that is what needs to happen. And I think that's what you do. And thank you so much for coming on. I'm sorry it went long. I had no idea.
That's okay. That's okay. I start hallucinating after an hour, so I don't want to do that. So thank you, Mama.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Jones. I will hope to see you sometime in person, but thank you, and God bless you. And I hope you have a wonderful New Year.
Thank you. Same to you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.